Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. Today we're talking about
dealing with negative aspects of fandoms. And so this is a reprise of a previous episode where we tackled a topic that we didn't quite get to the bottom of, at least in how to use philosophy and other things to deal with negative aspects. So, I mean, I think we did a pretty good job in covering what a fandom is and why people would be interested in it and positive aspects of fandom. And what do you think, Dan?
Well, definitely it's the bottom on two different aspects. We were finishing up the topic as well as talking about the basement, the dregs of this particular aspect that we have within our society. The fandom is a double-edged sword, and we're going to deal with the backhanded side here.
Yeah, we kind of felt like, we did a good job in setting out some of the general issues that can be negative with fandom, but I don't think we gave enough reflection guidance on what's wrong with those aspects and how to productively deal with them. So we wanted to go into a deeper discussion of each of these and, give you some advice, like, the title of the show says, some practical advice you can use in your everyday life for dealing with these various negative aspects. And, one of the things that came out of our discussion that I hadn't really thought about quite so much before we had it was just how central and important fandoms can be in so many people's lives. And I think, in mine as well, if I pay attention to all the things I'm into and get myself intellectually and emotionally invested in, there's a lot of different fandoms that I know I'm involved with and could have negative experiences with. And I think everyone
knows, some guy or gal that, gets way into one thing way too much, and that's like their entire experience. Say I don't know, some guy like the Lakers or the Cubs or the Yankees are just like everything to them, and that is their personality. But we're a social species. We like things, and we like to find the people that also like those things and hang out with them. That is like a natural aspect of the human experience. But sometimes, as with most things, you can use a pencil as a writing implement or a weapon. It is all on how one uses it.
Yeah, this is a bit of a side note, but you can't really be in a fandom, although I suppose you maybe could be a fan if you were isolated, not connected with other people who share those interests. I mean, you can be very introverted, you can be rather reclusive, you could be a collector of things that you don't ever show anybody. But I don't know that collecting at that point actually is fandom. I think that this social and relational aspect has to be part of it. I mean, do you agree with that? Or?
Yeah, for the idea of fandom, absolutely. You can be a fan. That's a singular. I like a thing, but to go into a fandom is inherently social. I absolutely agree.
Okay, so just a little bit of recap. There's some issues that maybe if somebody's listening to this and they haven't heard the other episode, they would, find useful.
What's a fandom?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So they need some clarification, right? So, is there a boundary to fandoms? I mean, there's like a million different things that they encompass. You mentioned sports is one example. I would say that music is another huge example. People are fans of a band, of a movement, of a particular kind of music. Gaming is huge, right? And there's overlap between nowadays gaming and TV or film. Sometimes games are made out of movies or vice versa.
They've only started to get good very recently.
That's true. Yeah, there's been an awful lot of terrible movies coming out of games.
Yeah.
Celebrities, people can be a Swiftie or a Sherlockian or all sorts of other things. Food. Any others that you think we need to mention? Or
Horses.
oh yeah,
Club scenes. Oh. You said food, didn't you?
yeah.
Oh. Streamers. Just YouTube personalities in general.
Right. Yeah, yeah. YouTube adds a whole different wrinkle to like the TV film thing because, I mean, you could be on YouTube and just, I don't know, peeling potatoes and somebody will watch it. And, somebody will have a comment. They're not peeling the potatoes right. This is the best way to peel potatoes.
So look at his technique. It's so fluid.
Yeah.
No, he's terrible.
If you peel a lot of potatoes, you ought to get good at it pretty quickly, I imagine.
You'd hope. Otherwise, you're just like, I don't know, chopping them up in a terrible way. But like these things, they become like really big, time sinks. Or well, I don't know, time sinks. People spend time with them. Like, I guess another examples are like trains or like slot car racing. Like these are hobbies that not only you're spending time, but like you might be building things or interacting with it in a more than just like consumption way, but like a creative way.
And it might involve research. The trains is a great example of that. I had a cousin who was into model trains and he would spend all this time researching particular train lines in the Chicagoland area and trying to, I guess you would say, reproduce or replicate on the table that he was working what this stuff would look like. So he spent an incredible amount of time getting the right trains, making the tracks go the right way. But, this is all based in some research that he was doing. And I think largely before the era of the internet. So it must have taken even longer to get all that information.
Absolutely.
Find where it is and determine what you're going to do. So, and like a few other points, fandom involves like all sorts of people. It's a very common phenomenon of all different walks of life. It's something that straddles social classes, generations, connects people together. And, sometimes it involves what we call parasocial relations or relationships, sometimes with the object of the fandom. So if you're into Taylor Swift, you probably don't know Taylor Swift, but you're probably into what she eats and wears and says in her songs, and you might feel like you actually have a connection with her. And sometimes it's with perceived important people or experts within the fandom. So I suppose if there's somebody, and I don't know the fandom of trains at all, but there's probably some very important experts when they come to the model railroad conventions. Everybody's like, oh, can you believe that so-and-so is here? This is going to be such a wonderful opportunity or something like that. And as you were pointing out just a little bit earlier, people really can invest a lot of time, but also money and, sometimes other resources as well in pursuing these activities. If you want to go to conventions, you got to travel, right? You've got to engage. I mean, nowadays that we have the internet, maybe you can do a lot of this stuff online a lot easier.
Yeah, it's much fandoms have exploded online, but this is also potentially one of the reasons why they get some of their bad rap, because once you're online, especially there's certain levels of anonymity, that you get people like, hey, Taylor doesn't eat toast with avocado from California. She only eats toast with avocado from Mexico. How dare you?
Is that, are you drawing that from something you've actually read, or are you just making
No,
that
I'm just...
Because,
yeah.
it's plausible that there's probably...
Totally plausible.
The other thing, too, along with that is not only is there the anonymity factor, but there's like a scale factor. So, when you've got millions and millions of fans, you're almost guaranteed statistically to have a couple kooky ones who totally lose the narrative and are obsessed with some. There's conceivably somebody who is worried about where her avocados come from,
I think the only person that should be concerned with that is her chef.
There you go. Not even her.
Yeah. I don't think she cares. Maybe she does. Who knows?
So we outlined a number of different negative aspects that we talked about previously, and we want to go a little bit deeper into as many of these as we can and talk about, what is this aspect? Why does it affect people negatively? And then give you some suggestions for how to deal with it. And, the number one thing that people bring up when you're like, what's wrong with fandoms? Gatekeeping. That's probably the first thing that comes to mind.
You're not a real Swiftie there, Greg. Sorry.
I was going to say, is that sigh expression of personal experience with having been gatekept in the past?
No, it was more along the lines of just enjoying the avocado toastness of the whole thing.
Yeah, I don't wind up getting gatekept that often anymore, but it's in part because most of the fandoms that I'm involved in, I'm an older guy. I think people presume that I've been involved in it for a long time. So, like, if it's classic metal, they're not going to be saying, "Oh, you're wearing an Iron Maiden T-shirt. Name 5 songs by that band." To me, the way they might be to somebody younger. But it is a huge problem. I see it happening in a lot of the things that I'm involved with. Sometimes it's disappointing to see somebody who you know and you up until that point respected doing that especially to younger people.
Yeah. Yes, the only time that I've been gatekept in the last long while is I met a guy who was a political mover and shaker, and he wanted to know who I knew so that he could bet on how much he should reveal to me or not. That was interesting.
So we'll jump into talking about what gatekeeping is, but I have a kind of funny story that I hadn't thought about for years and years and years, because it happened many years ago when I would have been in my mid-30s, and I was at a Lumen Christi event at the University of Chicago. So the University of Chicago is very elite, well-heeled, and Lumen Christi was this interesting organization or institution on campus. And I got involved in a conversation with this guy who was an older scholar. And he was from some important place, like maybe Northwestern or something like that. And I was talking about something that he'd brought up in his question. And I was like, well, there's this going on and this going on and this going on and this going on. And he turned and looked at me like, where the hell did this guy get this knowledge of, early 20th century French philosophy from? And the question that he asked me was, who are you? And I said, well, it's right there on my name tag, Greg Sadler, And he's like, no, what I mean is where are you from? Who do you know?
Mm-hmm.
Where is this stuff coming from? And I was like,
who did you teach under?
Study under.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I realized where he was going, and I was like, buddy, I'm nobody. I'm not anybody important. I'm not somebody who you should have known, because of the circles that you move in and you just missed out or forgot who I am. I'm nobody. I teach in a prison. I went to a small, university that doesn't have a great reputation. I just happen to have actually studied the stuff that you're talking about, because there's no actual bar to studying this stuff. Anybody can do it. You don't have to belong to an elite school. And I didn't say all of that, but he was just he was very confused that somebody who didn't come from the right circles could possibly be talking competently about this stuff. And that's sort of gatekeeping, sort of unconscious gatekeeping. He was wondering what the hell I was doing on the wrong side of the gate, when we want to keep the unwashed masses out. So. So what is gatekeeping? It is, so here's one general definition: the activity of trying to control who gets particular resources, powers, or opportunities and who doesn't. Fan lore has a more specific definition, calling it the act of trying to control fan activities, limit access to certain information, or define who is or isn't a real fan of a certain thing. So with a band, we could imagine like who gets to go backstage, or who gets to hang out with the musicians, or who gets to spend a little bit more time at the meet and greet. People questioning, oh, are you really an AC/DC fan? Name their top 10 albums. That sort of thing is pretty rife. But I think it happens.
What's your favorite 2 albums and why?
Yeah. I think it happens potentially.
How did Bon Scott die?
Oh, people might quiz each other about that sort of stuff too, right?
But like, why do we call it gatekeeping? Because this is a reference to like literal, like, being at the door to a club, and you have a gate that's going to separate your ability to be part of the club or be excluded from the club. One of the most well known is Bergheim in Berlin, which is a techno what's called techno DJ club, techno dance club, incredibly exclusive. People wait 4 hours in line to get in, like totally serious in that point. And then like they have a guy who determines if you are in or not just by how you look. It is like the definition of gatekeeping. He's at the gate. You get it in or not. It's up to him.
I guess you could say that in the foodie scene, things are like that as well. Are you getting invited to the soft launch of the new restaurant in town? Are you drinking the right sort of liqueur? And all this stuff is very faddish, Mm-hmm. That's part of the problem with a lot of gatekeeping is it winds up being about these very arbitrary aspects or dimensions, criteria, right? But it does affect people quite a bit. It sets up obstacles for people to actually participate in fandom, and it can be a huge turnoff for potential fans. People are interested. If they see somebody engaging in gatekeeping, they're like, well, I don't know if I actually want to be part of that community, and they make the experience more about being put down or controlled than geeking out about the stuff that you actually care about and love with people who presumably feel the same. So it can be a real damper.
Yeah, and like it negatively affects them through limiting the people who can talk to, reduce the ability for people who are especially new into a thing to becoming full participants.
Yeah.
That just always like sucks when you're like, hey, I'm starting to get into this thing, and you want to ask some questions, and you're going to ask some stupid questions. That every time that you get into something, you're going to ask stupid questions, and if they shut you down immediately, it's like, why do I even want to hang out with these people?
That's true. Yeah, there's that whole genre of like being pejorative or dismissive towards people who are called noobs, newbies, the beginners. And if you want to have a healthy fandom or a community of any sort, you got to be bringing new people in. It's
right.
Almost the opposite. I guess the attitude is we're only going to bring the right people in. We're going to exclude all the other people. So some suggestions. Some people feel that they have like a sacred duty to call bad behavior out. I think that's kind of a judgment call or personal choice. If you see other people doing it and you're already within the fandom, you could say, hey, you're gatekeeping, that's not cool, and then make some space for the new people. But if it's happening to you, then, I don't know, it could be helpful to say, hey, you're doing some gatekeeping here. Maybe the person doesn't realize it and they'll stop, or other people witnessing it will, intervene. But I don't think that you have a moral duty to do that. And I think some people trip themselves up by thinking that it's, if something bad like that happens to you, you must call it out, because you might be in a bad position where, in the local place where you are, right? Maybe everybody is excluding you.
Yeah. And then like you can maybe make a new place. And that's hey, we're gonna do have our own Star Wars watch party over this bar instead of that party because those guys are, yeah.
Yeah, they're making the experience not a fun experience.
Right.
I mean, another thing you can do is, you sort of realize that there's a tendency to think, oh, this person's standing in my way. They must be really important. They might just be some petty functionary, and this is the only place in their life that they have any semblance of power. You don't know, and you don't have to buy into whatever clout the gatekeeper presents themselves as having. I mean, you can just say, okay, you want to exclude me from this fandom. That's about you. It's not about me or anything. And maybe you can find other fans in other places that aren't being gatekept.
Yeah. It's like the idea of like, you get a small middle manager and it just goes to their head.
Oh.
What's that? A small tyrant or like,
tin pot tyrant is a term that I've used in the past. Yeah.
Yeah. You give someone, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I'm important, and now I have to utilize this, otherwise I won't feel important anymore. But.
Yeah. I mean, that might be why they sought out the position in the first place, is to deal with insecurities.
Are they aware of that, or is that like, I assume some are, and then some are, they're not maybe totally aware of like how their negative. Like, maybe they think that they're, like, trying to make the fandom better.
I think that is one of the, we'll call it, more innocuous justifications that people give. I mean, it's still a bad justification, right? Because unless you can show that your gatekeeping activity does, in fact, lead to a better fandom, and I don't know how you would demonstrate that, you're kind of just rationalizing your bad behavior, right?
Right.
I mean, can you think of any way that you could show a gatekeeper actually is making the fandom better? I mean, other than excluding like people who have no business being there whatsoever, that they want to disrupt things. But that seems like something anybody could handle.
Yeah,
right?
like I can think of like certain gatekeepers for like, you don't want to have. If you're a bartender, you don't want any skinheads in your bar because once one skinhead comes in, then he brings his friends, and now you're a skinhead bar. But that doesn't quite fit for fandoms, at least in my opinion. So I'm not quite sure. I guess only because I was reading about Berghain, this club in Berlin. Like there seems to be at least some. Because they have a very, very curated group of people for like, hey, we want you to, if you're going to be in the club, to be a participant and not a voyeur or just a tourist. Like if you want to be here, I want you to be participating. And if you're not participating, then we don't need you to be to be entertainment for you.
That is kind of an interesting idea. So like, let's say we take role-playing games, right?
Okay.
If you're going to go to a place where people are playing a role-playing game and then just say, I'm not going to play, I'm just going to sit back and watch, and maybe I'll record some of you on my phone or something, or take some notes or something, and you're not like a journalist or anything, I could see how people could say, yeah, this isn't for you. This is a little bit more private, I mean, at a concert, you're, spending. Well, it depends on what kind of concert. If it's a symphony concert, you get to clap at the end, but otherwise, sit down, shut the hell up the entire time, right? Don't get up and dance or anything like that. If you're at a rock concert and you're just sitting in the chair, looking at the band, not moving at all, people might be like, what's going on over here? Do you not like the performance? So, but they don't want you to like rush the stage, get up and participate by saying, hey, I'll take over the drumming duties right now, or let me be a roadie here. That's too much participation, Yeah,
I think we should move on to the obsessive focus that many fandoms have. So obviously, like, you start really broad and like, oh man, I like this TV show, and then you start like putting together things, and you go online and you start playing around like the deep lore, and you find other people who are, freeze framing every 5th second and like trying to put together the map, and like this was really bad in the Lost TV show.
I was just thinking about that.
That was like one of the very first times, and then it got to a point because like the showrunners like, oh my god, they're figuring it out, and so they would actually respond to that by changing the plot. I think it made the show worse because like nothing seemed to actually make any sense at the end of it. It was a giant puzzle box that just falls apart at the end. But there's that aspect of it, and then you get like, oh my god, are there conspiracy theories within the things like, oh, were the authors actually trying to like represent this, but they have to do it this way, and it's crazy.
Yeah, and that obsession can take a lot of different forms. It could be monetarily and materially, where like you have to have every bit of this, so you have to spend a lot of money on it, or spending too much time, you could say. And the biggest issue with this is not just getting obsessed about something. I mean, there's some things that maybe it's okay to be somewhat obsessive about, but you always have to ask, what am I taking time or money or attention away from? So if you're so obsessed with Lost that you can't relate to your kids, that would be a problem, or to your significant other because they're not into it, or God forbid, like they have a different view on what's going on in Lost, and now you can't get along anymore. That's too much, right?
Right. It seems like the definition of whenever you're addicted to a thing is like when the thing that you're doing becomes a hindrance for your normal life. That's obviously an obsession level. It's like that's I was supposed to go to work today, but I was like on the forums until 4 a.m, and I didn't wake up, and that's going to now impact your day-to-day life. And that's like, okay, that is a ringing bell of like, you need to look at this.
I like that bringing in addiction, because there's another feature of many addictions, which is that the thing that the person is addicted to, originally they were getting some pleasure out of it. Mm-hmm. And the pleasure kind of, goes up, and then it kind of recedes a bit. So it becomes a normalized part of their life. And at a certain point, it's less about getting your pleasure fix, and more about not feeling a sense of pain or disturbance or something negative, and the addictive thing lets you sub that in. So somebody who really is obsessed might not enjoy the Marvel universe as much as the more casual fan does, in part because they're spending so much time on it.
Yeah, and for all of our Wisdom for Life superfans out there, watch my blinks. There's Morse code there, but there's a cipher in there as well, so you got to figure it out. But
we're not that organized.
It makes you difficult to relate to other people, but also like it can serve to schism within fandoms, and it would sometimes makes it hard for you to interact with other people if you're so absolutely obsessed. Like I have a friend at one point in time who was just totally into Pokemon cards, and that was the only thing he would ever talk about. Yeah. And like, I really love this person. He's one of the greatest, my best friends, but like, god damn, I'm not into that, and I will humor him for a while, but I gotta stop.
That's an important thing. People get into a fandom because they're interested in the thing the fandom is oriented around, the object of the fandom. But they're also in it very often for all the other things that you get out of relationships, friend relationships. You want to share time with somebody. You want to like have meals together and not have to talk. Like if you're, a Trekkie, not everything would have to be about what the replicator could have given you at, whatever fast food that you're eating at the convention, right? You just want to like do normal stuff, even if you're wearing a Star Trek uniform. You go to a pub crawl and there it's about, what drink you're drinking, not necessarily about the technology that was in this particular episode. So I think that's something that a lot of people lose sight of. And so
the replicator Mark V Gamma was not able to synthesize these particular proteins, and so this is incorrect. How dare you?
Yeah, I mean, if you do that, you're probably not going to foster or retain very deep relationships with other fans. And this, go ahead.
This also, in part builds into the last thing we're talking about, gatekeeping, because you get so obsessed with these things that you're like, okay, if you're not on my level of obsession, then you're not actually a true fan.
Yeah. So with this one, I think we have to have advice both about what if it's you that's getting too obsessed, and then what do you do when other fans are overly obsessed? So, if you catch yourself getting overly obsessed, and it might actually be other people saying, hey man, you need to take it easy with this stuff, or hey, we're not talking about this all the time. You can appreciate the commitment that goes into it. But I think one of the things that's often driving this is what they call FOMO, fear of missing out. If I'm not thinking about this stuff all the time, then maybe I'm not a good fan, or I'm losing opportunities, But, everything in life is going to be like that. You can't do every single thing that you'd like to do. So maybe it's more about proportion, But what do you think you should do? So, let's say you've got this friend who's super into Pokemon. How do you deal with somebody like that?
Yeah, it's obviously you maybe make some parameters to the conversation. You want to tell them hey, I really like you, and we can talk about this, but it can't be the entire conversation. Gotta talk about this. A couple other things. Setting some parameters for those conversations can make it so that you can maintain your friendship even when they are over obsessing about a thing.
Now that's interesting, because I think more broadly, outside of just fandom, in relationships in general, a lot of people have a fear that if they try to set limits on a friendship, that is sort of trying to dominate or control the friendship, or it's going to be a bad thing. It's going to push the other person away. And so then they don't do it, and then they wind up being dissatisfied, and it doesn't turn out to be a good friendship because of that. When if they had imposed some limits, I mean, not crazy limits, but some, respectful boundaries, that actually conduces to good relationships. Even in very intense romantic partner relationships, it's okay to say, listen, I'm cool with this, I'm not cool with this.
Yeah. And you can either set up beforehand or just in the middle of the conversation. It's hey, and they're just totally trying to change the conversation. That happens all the time. But just you have to have the wherewithal to say okay, I would like to talk about this and bring it up in a natural enough way that allows you to actually transition to a different topic.
That's very interesting too, because I think a lot of people may labor under the assumption that if they had a problem with something, they should have brought it up at the very beginning rather than after the conversation has been exclusively focused on this particular Pokemon for 10 minutes, So I think it's healthy to say, okay, I was cool talking about this for 5 minutes, but, now it's too much,
Right. Absolutely.
Should we talk about the next one?
Yeah, let's talk about classification.
So, go ahead.
Please.
Well, so one person, when we were polling about problems with fandom, said, "What I find annoying about Zoomer music fans is their excessive need to periodize a novice artist's work as already belonging to an era. You see this especially in contemporary pop and rap subgenres." And then somebody else wrote, "Over schematization, I mean here lists and infighting over which thing is objectively best or most correct." And I think we can talk about both of these as being examples of people who are, kind of focusing on the abstract, not really getting into the object of the fandom, and they want to have nice, neat lists and classifications. I don't know that it's a Zoomer issue. I think every generation has people like this. Where they're like, okay, this particular band is this style of music for their first 3 albums, and then they shifted because they incorporated these influences. That can be useful, but it doesn't actually tell you that much about the particular band or music, And I think some people get really obsessed with that. I think that's also an issue for sports fans.
Yeah, and a lot of this is, like subjective classification anyways, like even if you're taking sports, you're like talking about like like players over eras, and they're like different rule sets and different stadiums or different like things change in it. I was like, how can you compare I don't know, Wilt Chamberlain to a current
basketball icon,
like LeBron or something, like can you like there's a totally different game, a totally different set of rules. Like heck, Wilt changed the rules because of the sky,
his athletic abilities. I think about like conversations that I hear on sports radio where they're endlessly debating about whether this quarterback in American football is in the top tier with, whoever they happen to pick at the time, or whether they are just a franchise quarterback or not even a franchise quarterback. And, it's basically there to fill up airtime and keep these media personalities in jobs, because there is no right answer to this stuff.
Right. And then and then you have the people that like the Colin Cowherds of the world that say just the opposite things, because people get all railed up. It's like, oh my god, he's choosing a different classification than I am, so he can talk about it. Like, he doesn't care. He's just there to be a contrarian, and knowing that people get way into classifying things, and that he can like make a living off of that.
Yeah, sometimes the recommendations based on classification can be off as well, because they fail to connect up the things, right? So somebody will be like, oh, you like this author? They're in this genre. Well, you're going to like this author who's in the same genre, but they write in a completely different way. Some genres are just too big, like young adult. I mean, you like this young adult author, there's no guarantee you're going to like this one. But it could be like, this is vampire, cyberpunk, young adult, and this other book over here, this is also vampire, cyberpunk, young adult. You're bound to like them. Well, no, there's no guarantee that just because you came up with these categorizations, which, by the way, are less about like perfect boundary lines, and they're more about like where to shelf things in the bookstore or in Amazon and how to make money on them, right?
Right. I was like, hey, you're in a genre, but you're a crap writer. Great. Your genre is cool, but I don't like your writing. Like, you can, that's really like, should be the arbitration. Is the writing, is the prose good? Is it engaging? Then it doesn't really matter what genre it is. I'll read something from hundreds of years ago if it's engaging.
Yeah. And interestingly, the stuff that we call classics are generally the ones that were engaging from hundreds of years ago, because all the schlocky crap that, sort of flooded the market at the time hasn't been read. I mean, if you actually go back into periods of literature, you find that there's we have the classics that we identify, and then there's lots and lots of mediocre stuff that just has fallen through all the cracks,
Your penny dreadfuls, your bodice strippers,
exactly.
Your pulp fiction.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same way in the field of philosophy. There's all these authors who were considered big at the time, and we don't read them anymore because they're really not that interesting. But coming back to the classification, so, what's negative about this? We've already covered some of that. I think one of the problems with it is it turns the activity of sharing fandom, which should be a kind of friendship thing, into something more abstract, maybe even bureaucratic, you could say, just less interesting, less engaging. Do you want to sit around and chat with somebody who's like trying to figure out exactly where to slot each thing in? I mean, if you're into that, cool, but most of us aren't, I think.
The difference between like, hey, this is cool. Do you think it's cool? Yeah, it's pretty cool. Instead of like, this has to be better than that.
That's true. Yeah, there's a lot of like inferences that get carried out.
So how do we deal with this, right?
Yeah. I think that the people that are engaging in that, you're not going to change them. That's where they happen to be right now. And so maybe, you don't have to get upset about it. This is how they relate to the fandom. And let's say it's a less productive way, but it doesn't have anything to do with you. It's not personal. They're not trying to put you in a box. They just don't have what you want. So maybe you have to move on to other people and have the kinds of conversations or interactions that you actually want to have. You're just not going to have it with overclassifiers, or I don't know what else we would call these people,
And I think this is only really an issue for like people who like that's their only way they're engaging, because it seems that all fans to a certain extent have a little bit. It's like, oh man, like tell me your favorite Star Wars film.
Yeah,
that's a lot of times it's also like dependent upon the era you grew up in, like. There's people who think the prequels are better than the originals because they grew up with them. Those were their touchstones of their childhood.
It seems that almost nobody thinks that the postquels are better than the prequels or the original ones, though.
Yeah, well, and if Empire isn't the best, then you're objectively wrong. But let's move on.
So another big problem is fans that get like super defensive about whatever it is that their fandom is concerned with. And it's kind of like an overprotectiveness or insecurity that's exhibited sometimes towards outsiders. So you're protecting the fandom against the barbarians at the gates. But it can also happen against people in the fandom who see things differently. And one of the people that, wrote in said it can make a person dismissive of legitimate criticisms of the thing one is a fan of. Being defensive about criticism, people who engage with and see the thing differently, especially other fans. This is a big problem. I think there's a lot of people who feel that if you're into something, you have to be on team that something, and you have to say everything about it is good.
Right.
I'm not sure where that comes from. Probably a lot of different sources.
Yeah. This is... Maybe I have a bit about conspiracy theories, which I would consider to, at least for some of them, to be fandoms.
Okay. That's an interesting idea. Yeah.
So, especially like QAnon. Like that, there's a person that people would follow. He would do some drops, and people would like try to like figure out whatever. Drops are just like text messages on a board. And they're like, they're cryptic, and so you're trying to figure out what he's saying, and then there's a whole like community of people that are like working together to try to figure this stuff out. It didn't seem to be based in anything in reality, but people really liked it. To a point where people would lash out for people like thinking, he's there's a thing at one point in time, like they're saying like, oh, he's not the original Q anymore, and so who's the real Q and who's the current Q, and so there's the schism between those who are like, oh, it's always been the same person, or no, there's been a change up, and then you would be ostracized if you were one or the other because you thought that he wasn't authentic anymore. But I guess this comes down to this idea of this in-group and having this power position within that in-group that kind of spoke about earlier, especially for those people who are gatekeeping. If you have power position, you have status.
that sort of aspect, though, of I must protect this, valuable thing that other people don't understand or are trying to besmirch or attack or whatever it happens to be,
Right. And there's a need to keep it pure and not, how to say, not degraded by bringing new people in or having it be focused towards some new group.
Yeah, and it's really about thinking that it's pure more than actually keeping it pure, right?
Right. So how do we deal with this purity? As we can realize that objects of fandom don't have to be perfect, and with no bad qualities, tendencies, or actions, in order to be overall valuable.
I think a lot of people have this very black and white thinking. Something is either good or it's bad, and so if you can say anything bad about it, then, it's completely bad. I mean, we get this a lot in philosophy, right? Mm-hmm. Particularly when we're thinking about ancient, medieval, modern philosophers who had some kind of backwards views about particular things. We don't say, well, Aristotle got women wrong, and he did in a whole bunch of different ways. So therefore, it's all crap. Throw it all out, I mean, there are people who are like that. They're like, ooh, David Hume committed a racism. We need to get rid of him. But, I mean, those are generally in the minority. And, you can rightly call out the things that are problematic about a thinker without saying, all of their work is garbage. We can't care about them at all,
Yeah, it's kind of like my opinion about Orson Scott Card. I don't think he's a particularly great person, but I do like his books, which is kind of difficult.
Yeah, the Ender series is some really, I mean, especially after you get past Ender's Game. I like the other books even more.
The Dad and Children of the Mind.
I mean, viruses that can be sentient. I mean, that's a cool idea. These planets where each one has got its own kind of shtick to it. That's all pretty cool stuff. But yeah, I mean, as a person, I don't know that I'd want to hang out with him.
No. And think of any individual person. None of us are perfect. None of us has never been totally without some place that we could potentially apologize for, as well as the eras that people live in. And it's okay, and so we know that you and I are not perfect. So why do you expect all of these thinkers or these pieces of media to be perfect? You take the things that you like, and you kind of ignore the stuff that you don't. As much as possible.
Or if it really is problematic, it's okay to say, well, here's a great example. In philosophy, I like reading Martin Heidegger. I think that he is an insightful commentator on a lot of stuff. He also was a Nazi. And we know now, too, that it wasn't just I just happen to belong to the party because that was expected at the time. There were these black notebooks where it's crystal clear that he was committed to it. Does that mean that we have to throw away being and time and say, that's all Nazism? No, but it also means that I'm not going to go and the stuff where it is kind of Nazi influenced, I'm not going to work with that stuff,
You're not going to cosplay some Heidegger there?
Yeah. So if I was going to cosplay a philosopher, it probably would not be Martin Heidegger, especially since I'd have to, my mustache, I'd have to trim it in a little Hitler style mustache. That was the thing at the time, right? So that's a giveaway, right? I'd probably do Aristotle because, although I'd have to take off my glasses, I got the longish hair and the beard and stuff like that. So I could probably pass off like him. Yeah. I'd probably have to wear a toga or something, but
your tunic and toga, definitely.
There you go. Yeah.
All right.
So coming back to the defensiveness, though, I think one other thing that a person can do is if you find yourself getting defensive and needing to defend your fandom, think about why you have such a strong reaction. Does the fandom really need you to be its champion? it's not as if most of the criticisms people raise are actually going to be taken all that seriously. So why be so prickly about it? What's going on with you?
Yeah. And so now we descend further into toxic fandoms. So obviously, like, fandoms, we're talking about, like, the bad aspects, but, like, fandoms can, like, get really nasty as, like, this kind of groupthink, and this bandwagoning and dogpiling can happen.
Yeah.
So fans become hostile not only to fellow fans, but even to what they are supposed to be fans of. So this is also referred to as a broken or entitled fandom, and can include aspects of being racist, misogynist, ageist, ableist, etc. For fans or groups within a fandom. It's sad to see, like, how hard people can turn against people.
Yeah, and I don't think there's a lot of fandoms where this can't emerge. I don't think there's any object that's going to, even philosophy, right? You'd be like, oh, philosophers should be completely rational. Huh. No, they're not. they are regular people and get into all sorts of tiffs with each other. So I think that, a lot of times this emerges when people have really invested their, whatever we want to call it, their personality, their identity in the fandom, and there's kind of a gatekeepery aspect to it. They feel like they're the true fans, and they, like you said, they'll even turn against the object of the fandom itself if it is perceived to have let them down. So, we see this a lot, but I was also, like, this is where I was actually originally putting this idea of conspiracy theories, because there's the status comes from being in a position of power or influence from a fandom, and if they don't have any status anywhere else, and so that's when they get subsumed by the fandom, whatever it is, and this causes harder gatekeeping and keeping the tenets of the fandom, and prevents one's ability to see negative aspects of it, and so there was a TV show, and I was trying to find it, but I couldn't remember exactly what it was. But it was a deep dive into a whole bunch of people that were especially big into the 9/11 conspiracy theorists. Okay, and they would kind of, like, walk them through all the information, like, why it wasn't the things that they were thinking was, and even like, had them interview the family members of the people that died, because part of that conspiracy was that the people didn't actually die, that these aren't actually real people on the planes in the first place. And the only person that changed their mind was a person that had a position of power and reputation in another conspiracy theory group as well. And because it's like, oh, well, my entire, like, aspect isn't totally wrapped up within this one thing, I was able to, like, I don't need that, whereas a lot of the other people need it. That has, like, become such a core portion of their personality that they are the fandom. Yeah, and I don't want to say that, like, every turning against is necessarily toxic fandom. And I'll give you an example from recent history. So Game of Thrones, the HBO series, it's inspired by George R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, which at this point is 5 big, thick books sketching out this world that includes Westeros and Easteros or Esteros or whatever it is. And it's this really big panoramic story that's being told about a war that's happening and supernatural dangers coming from the north and all of that. And it's very rich and it's very cool. And you can understand why HBO would be interested in adapting it. And when they did, so long as they stuck pretty close to the books, it was pretty good, By the last 2 seasons, it was so far off book, and they'd screwed up a number of plots and kind of changed the nature of a bunch of characters. And they were listening less and less to George R. R. Martin as a consultant and more kind of doing their own thing. And it significantly declined in quality to the point where a lot of people were like, this is just garbage, And the last season didn't satisfy anybody. lot of people are like, this doesn't even make sense, you know. But you know, they wanted to wrap it up so they could go work for Disney and do Star Wars things and stuff.
And then
like that.
They screwed it up the last season so badly that they lost that deal.
Yeah. So, you know, criticizing that is not being a toxic fan. If you were automatically against them because you can't possibly adapt a series like this to television, okay, that might be being a toxic fan. But it also takes the form of like expecting everything has to stay the same too. You know, when people complain about, oh, this went woke or stuff like that because they talk about some social justice issues, which probably were there earlier. You know, for example, people these days who are like, you know, the original Star Trek was so much better because it wasn't woke like like Picard was or anything like that. You're like, have you watched the original series? You know, have you like paid attention to the sort of things that they're saying, or the fact that they put a black person on the bridge and that actually took a lot of work, or, you know, what is their economics like? I think a lot of people, they have like their particular view of what the fan object ought to look like, and they just want that and nothing else, you know. And this happens in music all the time too, right? Some band, like, you know, grows a little bit, puts out a new album, and you're like, this isn't the stuff I'm used to. So you turn against it, you know. This is garbage.
It's like Rage Against the Machine, for twofer there, both like people misunderstanding what they are and their political opinions, as well as they change their music at a couple albums in order to become more authentic to what their original noise, their sound was. But people like, oh, you've changed up your sound a little bit, and then people move against that.
Yeah, and they get very dramatic with it. Oh, this is the end of the world, you know? Well, maybe they'll do something you like on the next album. You know, just wait and see a little bit. Yeah. So we're going to come up to the top of the hour pretty soon, so we should talk about like how to deal with toxic fandoms.
Yeah. So you got to realize these toxic behaving people, it's, you know, really about their mindset, which has to do with their issues and not something that you have to fix. It's not on you, it's on them.
Yeah, and I think it's possible. We talked about limits, boundaries a little bit earlier. You can deal with people like this. You can set down limits and say, listen, I'll go with you on a little bit of this, but I'm not going to like go down the rabbit hole of condemnation with you. And why not? Because that's what those people really want to spend their time on. And what we want to spend our time on is the positive aspects of fandom that drew us in the first place. You could set as a rule of thumb, if you're spending most of your time dealing with negative stuff in a particular fandom, it might have gone toxic. You know, yeah. Maybe it's no longer a good place to be for you. You know.
Yeah, and like we talked about, like when you need to distance yourself from people in the past, and this isn't one of these aspects. Like realizing when certain aspects and certain groups are now becoming detrimental to your health and well-being, becomes potentially a schism point for you to move on to something else.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's up to us. You know, it's not as if just because you committed to something 2 months ago that you can't reconsider it and say, okay, now I'm being rational. I see that this was good back then, but it's not good for me now. I'm going to impose some limits.
Or find some other place to go that's, you know, not that group. Maybe even make your own place.
That's true. There's. I think people lose sight of the fact that we do have a lot of options. Yeah. So, do you want to lead us out on a final thought?
Yeah, we leave you today with the words of Henry Jenkins. Fandom, after all, is born of a balance between fascination and frustration.